Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, Waqar Rizvi. This week we're going to be discussing Saudi-Iranian relations, and we're of course being broadcast live both on satellite as well as throughout BMTV's various social media channels as well. Please do send in your comments or questions if you have any throughout this show, and we will, if we can, try to get to them with our expert panelists as well. Now, of course, Saudi-Iranian relations, if we look back at the history of these relations, have been frosty essentially since the 1979 revolution in Iran. However, there have been many points in which the two governments have worked together and or come to understandings through talks or otherwise. Now, in the ensuing years, issues such as regional influence have eroded trust and diplomacy between the two sides at various points as well. Now, the Saudi coalition's involvement in Yemen, its hesitance in supporting the JCPOA, i.e. the Iran nuclear deal, the Hajj stampede that killed several important Iranian officials, as well as executions of religious scholars and activists, have hurt the Saudi image in Iran. Now, on the flip side, at the same time, Iranian involvement in countries like Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, even Bahrain and others has made the Saudis uncomfortable as well, of course, as the alleged Iran nuclear program. Now, despite these ideological as well as geopolitical differences, both sides have been sitting down for talks, and there have been at least 5 rounds or 6 rounds, depending on who you believe, over these years in an effort to come to an understanding between the two sides, the latest talks being held, of course, in Baghdad. Now, this may be a sign of progress, but the latest rumors indicate that the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers may be meeting directly very soon. How much should we read into that? Will the Saudis and the Iranians be able to move beyond their differences to then better regional stability and security as well? I'm going to put those issues and others to our esteemed panelists who are joining us live today. We're joined by Drs. Aziz Alghashian as well as Dr. Nader Hashemi. Aziz is a Saudi researcher. He's also a fellow with the Project Satad, which stands for Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization, which is affiliated with the Richardson Institute at Lancaster University. Nader is an associate professor. He's also the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Nader and Aziz, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Nader, I'd like to start with you, if I may. I was just reading a statement before coming on air, coming out of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, saying that even though there has been a lot of positive talk coming out of these talks, that actually right now those agreements which have been reached have not yet been implemented, seemingly by the Saudi side. Do you think that there is already hiccups in this process? Okay, it seems we're having some audio difficulties with Nader. We'll get back to him. Aziz, I'll put the same question to you. Do you think that there are already hiccups possibly in this process at this time? I mean, obviously it's to be expected that talks are always going to be back and forth and there will be some obstacles.
Yes, well, firstly, good evening to you and good day to Nader and Eid Mubarak to all. Indeed, I think firstly, hiccups are inevitable. The very fact that they are actually speaking and talking and attempting to reconcile is a positive issue. Now, the fact that there have been obstacles should not be surprising, and there will be there will be obstacles. And I think both parties entered into this these discussions with a spirit of skepticism because they know the extent of obstacles they have to overcome. So in my opinion, I don't see this as a definitive juncture. I do think this is part of the process. And I think given the backdrop of reconciliation that's taken place in the region and the theme of rapprochement in the region, we've seen this taking place between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. We've seen this taking place between UAE and Turkey, between Saudi Arabia and Turkey very recently. I think this is, there is a frame or a theme on momentum for reconciliation. So I don't see it as the last part of these the efforts. I see these attempts. Perhaps this may be even an incentive to carry on discussions.
Yeah.
And perhaps elevate, but I don't see the elevation now taking place.
Yeah. So what do you put it down to why we're seeing this at this time, Aziz? As I said, of course, there have been several rounds of talks. So it's not like these were the first rounds of talks in Baghdad, but nevertheless, why this time? Does it have to do with, as the Iranians would call it, the diminishing US role in the region and the realization of countries in the region that, hey, we need to work together, not depend on external powers? Is that what's happening?
That's certainly one of the elements of it. There's also a clear realization by many of the ruling elites in the region is that, firstly, I think their relations, their international relations with other factors, with other powers, it has been very turbulent. They've been, due to their own domestic politics, be it in the United States or in Europe or Russia or China, they all have their own turbulences domestically, which then influences their relations with the respective Middle Eastern countries or Middle Eastern North African countries. So, and alongside that, there is this element, and I think notion that they agree upon that, listen, demonization and antagonism hasn't worked for anybody. It just simply hasn't been very constructive over the past years. And, I think what they're all doing is that they're trying to, create an environment where they could mitigate these relations, these disagreements. But the thing is, there's a lot to overdo. There's a lot to undo and overcome. And so, they've spent, especially the past 6 years, they spent a long time treating the other side as the the beacon of problems. Both sides have done this, and sometimes there are issues, there are genuine issues that states have, but this is again part of the process. So that's what's taken place now. It's a process.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'd like to add some comments.
Okay, so let me try to see if I can go back to Nader. Nader, we apologize for those audio difficulties, but I wanted to bring you in, Nader, and ask you then about the timing of all this right now. As I put to Aziz, of course, and you may be listening, these were not the first round of talks, so it's not like this has come out of a vacuum. But nevertheless, why now? Does it have to do with, as the Iranians said, and as I put to Aziz, the US, in the Iranians' point of view at least, walking away from the region in a sense, and that allows then for better regional cooperation?
Yeah, I agree with most everything that Aziz has said. I think one of the big factors is the election of Joe Biden as president, and the fact that in the recent US presidential election, Saudi Arabia came under severe criticism by Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. The Saudi regime knows that its prestige, its reputation in the United States has sunk to historic lows. You can look at public opinion. You could look at the outrage in American civil society toward the war in Yemen. And I think that is a huge factor. It's not just the withdrawal of the United States or perceived withdrawal of the United States. I would argue that the United States is still very much entrenched in the Middle East. But I think what we're seeing here is a recalculation and a realization in Riyadh that they have to calibrate their foreign policy much more closely with the United States and try and mend fences with Iran, because that's very much the position of the Biden administration. The Biden administration wants to withdraw further from the region, and in order to do that, it has to strike a deal with Iran with respect to its nuclear program. But I think all of this will change at the drop of a hat if Donald Trump returns to the White House. Those were the glory days for the Saudi crown prince. It's very clear right now that Saudi policy with respect to the crisis in Yemen and the reluctance to pump oil into the international market, as the Americans want the Saudis to do, is very much motivated by this calculation that they want to make Joe Biden's, the Saudis, that is, the Saudi government wants to make Joe Biden's life as difficult as possible, hoping that Trump and Kushner can come back into power, and that will be back to the glory days of 2016 to 2020. That's very much going on. So all of these talks and reconciliations that we're seeing, wonderful. Everyone who believes in peace should celebrate them. But all of this, I think, will wither away if Trump comes back into the White House, and that's a huge factor.
If I may, though, push you on that point, Nader, that you just made, I mean, I wonder, and the Saudis would probably argue, and I will ask Aziz this probably after the break, but, they would say it's too simplistic to say that the U.S. would influence their decision-making or policy-making towards Iran and to this extent. I mean, and the point I'm making is that the Saudis, for example, did not and have not gone along with the Americans, for example, against Russia over Ukraine. So as an example, then does that then not mean that the Saudis are actually looking for more independent, quote-unquote, policy-making, even possibly towards Iran?
Well, yes, the Saudis are making their own foreign policy, but they're also making their own calculations based on the domestic, conflict and dispute within the United States between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Saudi royal family had a very good relationship with Donald Trump and Jared Kushner. Recently it was announced that Kushner was able to raise $2 billion from MBS, who then is going to invest some of that money in Israel. All of these suggest, a very close desire to reconstitute and recalibrate that relationship if the Trump family can return to the White House. So, let's also not forget that, yes, there are tensions at this moment between the United States and Joe Biden. But, the Saudi-American relationship goes back to 1945 when King Abdulaziz met with then President, Theodore Roosevelt on an aircraft carrier and struck up an alliance that has lasted until this day. So I think the Saudi foreign policy planners are very attuned to what is happening in Washington, D.C. They don't want to jettison and they don't want to break away from the United States. In fact, they're demanding some sort of new military alliance and agreement with the United States. What they don't like and what they deeply despise is the human rights discussion, the name Jamal Khashoggi being repeatedly mentioned by the Biden administration in meetings with the Saudi crown prince, the reference to heroic human rights activists like Lujain al-Hathloul and the Saudi dissident Salman al-Auda. Those things upset the Saudi royal family. They don't like the Democrats. They want the United States to be on the side of Saudi Arabia, but they want the Republicans in charge of that because there's less discussion of human rights.
All right, Nader, I'm going to cut you off because we're just about to go into a break, but I just wanted, of course, to let our viewers know that we will be back after this break. We will continue this discussion. I'll bring, of course, Aziz back in and we will get a response to, of course, some of the things that Nader there said. We'll be back right after this break. Please do stay tuned for that. We'll continue discussing Saudi-Iranian relations right after this. Welcome back, everyone. You're still watching The Scope here on BMTV, and we're continuing to discuss Saudi-Iranian relations with Nader Hashemi and Aziz Alghashian. Aziz, I'll bring you back into the conversation. I want to ask you, in fact, about the angle of not just the United States, but in fact, around the talks, the Baghdad talks were happening between the Saudis and the Iranians. There was an article that came out in Israeli media, and it was sort of alarmist in the sense that it spoke about how the Abraham Accords may be under danger or are in danger if the Saudis and the Iranians become closer. Do those external factors actually influence Saudi decision-making, or is this genuinely, as I put to, now they're more just independent policy-making on the kingdom's part?
Yeah, well, I think regarding the article and the kind of the gist of the article, I personally won't agree to that, because I think if you look at the Abraham Accords and if you look at the main protagonists in the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates, it had steady relations with Iran. But when that didn't stop Bennett and the Prime Minister of Israel to visit the United Arab Emirates. So I don't see it being a real significant factor. And also, I mean, it's important to know, as someone who focuses on Saudi foreign policy towards Israel, I'm very familiar with the notion that Israeli discourse and Israeli media tend to try to create this very simplistic dynamic that this is this is a kind of enemy versus the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of logic in the region. So I don't see it heading towards that way. The relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran are far more complex. And just one thing to say about what the colleague Nader said is that indeed there is this calculation and there is this still vision and perception that they're basing on, or that their calculation is based on what will take place in 2024, whether the White House, who will be in the White House. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we are all seeing a particular a lack of rushing to an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it's not really just Saudi Arabia that are kind of hedging their bets or building their policy on what happens in the United States, because Iran does that too. Iran, when Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in 2018, it actually unified Europe. It got Russia on board, but that wasn't good enough for the ruling elite in Iran. They wanted the United States. They really wanted the United States. So that really does speak to this notion that, firstly, the United States is still present in the region. People are kind of orbiting around its influence, orbiting around what takes place and what it does. And so, it's still entrenched in that matter, as Nader said. So, things are fluid at the minute. And that's why, we're starting to see a reluctance and a particular hesitancy sometimes towards the two.
Nader, sure. If I may come in, Aziz, I just wanted to bring in, if you allow me, because I wanted to ensure we speak about Yemen as well, because Nader, I wanted to ask you, in fact, about Yemen, and that is, of course, a huge aspect of the differences between the Iranians and the Saudis, right? And both sides would say, Nader, that they are on opposite sides, supporting opposite sides. The Iranians supporting the Houthis, the Saudis supporting the quote unquote internationally recognized government. What do you make of that? Because right now we seemingly have somewhat of a ceasefire in Yemen. Does that also then make things more conducive towards an understanding between these two in the region? And does that then bode well for other such places, be it Iraq, even Lebanon? I mean, Lebanon's about to have elections very soon too.
Yeah, look, Yemen is a big factor. I think it's probably the biggest point of discussion right now between the Saudis and the Iranians. Yemen is in Saudi Arabia's backyard. Saudi Arabia wants to exert maximum influence over Yemen because of its close proximity and because of its perceived security concerns that it has. Not that different, I would point out, than the arguments that we're hearing from Vladimir Putin and Ukraine. They make identical arguments. That is, Putin and MBS make identical arguments about why they're intervening in neighboring countries. But let me just, speak to the core point here that your listeners really need to, I think, appreciate. And this applies to Yemen. It applies to, all of the points of conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Fundamentally, we are dealing with two deeply corrupt, authoritarian, and despotic regimes. These regimes don't care about the welfare of their own people. They don't care about Islamic ethics. They don't care about regional peace. They care fundamentally about regime survival. So they make their calculations both internally and regionally based on that calculation. How can they advance their own regime's survival first and foremost? Which is why I'm fundamentally skeptical that these talks that we're hearing about are going to last very long, because the two, the ruling elites in both capitals, are fundamentally interested in a different set of questions than I think most of your listeners are interested in with respect to fundamental issues of peace, good governance, democracy, human rights. And so that's why I view perpetual conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think we're in a temporary pause. We're happy that there's discussions taking place, but no one should think that this is a breakthrough. This is a turning point. These countries are going to be at conflict as long as political authoritarianism rules Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's the fundamental challenge for those of us, at least in the Muslim community, who care about ethics, who care about human rights, who care about democracy, is facing that fundamental challenge both in Saudi Arabia and in Iran. That's the way I see it.
Aziz, Nader brought up a really good point there. I wonder what your thoughts on that, because yes, there would be an argument by the international community to be made about certainly human rights in both countries. I don't want to get into a human rights argument or debate, but in the sense that how that may actually influence whether or not they can actually become closer as well, because they do stand really, if we're completely honest, on two polar opposites sometimes when it comes to even ideology, governing ideology too.
Yeah, well, the question of democracy and civil society is something that really doesn't just plague Iran or Saudi Arabia. It really plagues the region in general. This is a question that, unfortunately, is that requires more attention. And then there are developments. I mean, here in Saudi, you can see there are trying to have developments. And one thing I would say is that, well, every government is designed for survival. And so, there might be times where it's more and there might be times where it's less. But I think, what I could say about this matter is that, listen, we've seen, and perhaps we've allowed the focus to be on the governments, that, they are the ones that are controlling the discourse. And people and listeners on this channel, for example, this great channel, do tend to see and listen to this particular discourse. And I think it's time to really listen to the bottom-up aspects rather than the top-down aspects, and rather than from government to government. It's really time to listen and look at the communities and what they're saying and their commonalities. Because a lot of the times here in the Middle East, it's really a top-down issue, and discourse is a top-down issue. But there are people that will like to see more reconciliation. There will like to be people that think or have a different perspective of these relationships. And not only that, now why is it important? But it's really important because it could actually encourage people. Now, this is the issue. Between not just Iran and Saudi Arabia, but many states in the region, is that they have a domestic audience that they have to adhere to. And if they say something, this may be contradicting to the previous stances. So it is up to us, the bottom up. It is up to us, the people, the observers, the people that are, generating content, to really create that space for reconciliation and play a more constructive role and initiate that constructive role. This is what I'm trying to do. So I think the focus is too much on, what this government is doing, and what that government is doing, and what this government is doing, and what they say and they say. It's time for, an initiative, a bottom-up initiative where people like ourselves, like what we're doing here, we may not agree on everything, but we also agree on things, and conversation, dialogue is really the one of the factors that can play a role here.
Yeah, could I pick up on that very quickly?
Sure, go ahead, Nader.
Yeah,
sure.
I just want to applaud what Aziz just said about the bottom-up approach. Sadly, there are very few locations where Iranian civil society activists, students, intellectuals, and Saudi civil societies activists and students can meet and interact with one another, get to know one another, break down stereotypes and barriers. One of the things I love about teaching in the United States is that for all of its failings, it's still an open society and free society. I love interacting with my Saudi students, even though I come from Iran. We get along fabulously well once we get to know each other. I'm happy to report that on Clubhouse and in other locations, there is a new effort to bring Iranians and Saudis together. Both communities have been been, separated for very long. There's a lot of propaganda that surrounds the relationships between the two countries that's coming from the capitals. But when you bring Saudis and Iranians together, you find that they have a lot more in common than what separates them. So this type of, shared interest, these types of, what are sometimes called track two, diplomacy or dialogues, is something that I really want to encourage. And kudos to this program for having this type of discussion. I'd like to see more of it. I think it's really the way forward. I have no hope in the ruling governments in Tehran and in Riyadh. I have a lot of hope in civil society in Iran and Saudi Arabia that they could sort of lead the way forward in the coming months and years.
Sure. Okay. We may have to leave that as a final word, actually, Nader and Aziz, but we really appreciate both of you taking your time out of your no doubt busy schedules to speak to us today. That was Nader Hashemi speaking to us. He is an associate professor as well as director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Joseph Corvell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. We were also joined by Aziz Alghashian, who's a Saudi researcher and a fellow with Project Safad, which stands for Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization, which is affiliated with the Richardson Institute at Lancaster University. We discussed there, a sensitive topic, and I'm happy that Nader and Aziz both have appreciated this, because I always believe it's really important to have these calm discussions, even about sensitive topics of differences. We will, of course, be back next week with just as hot a topic, hopefully, and we would love for you to join us certainly about that as well. We will continue to always highlight issues which are even sensitive, but we will try to do that in a very mature and calm fashion here on The Scope, here with me, Waqar Rizvi. Thank you very much for watching.